Welcome to the Single Era Diaries, exploring the journey of a woman who hasn't experienced what it's like to be single in her entire adult life, and pretty much most of her teenage life too. Each episode will navigate the journey of finding a sense of identity, exploring the challenges of co-parenting, finding love of self and healing, all whilst tackling the complexities of the checkered landscape of dating and dating apps, meeting new people, and operating solo in a world that celebrates couples, marriage, and codependency. I am your host, founder of Nascent Media and newly single woman, Jade Graham, and this is the diary of my single era. Let's talk about the impact of attachment styles on relationships. I actually did an episode on attachment styles way back on series 1 of the Single Era Diaries, but I figured, given that there's so much change going on currently in my own life, and I'm sure the lives of many others, it would be worthwhile revisiting this topic because it is something that is really prevalent and it shows up a lot. There was a quote that I mentioned by the actor Kerry Washington. She said that how we were parented is how we go on to partner, and there really is some truth in that. Attachment styles in relationships do generally fascinate me. Perhaps more so is the concept that those attachment styles are largely formed and contributed to in terms of what they will go on to become as we're adults. That's very much formed in our early years. And I did happen across this idea whilst listening to Kerry Washington a couple of years ago now. She was in an interview on the Goop podcast talking about relationships and attachment, and she said that line, how we are parented is how we partner. And I do remember at the time being struck by that comment, and it really giving me a moment of pause, but I didn't give it a great deal more thought until that is now, where I find myself being faced with the pretty full and glaring reality that my own style of attachment is one that I believe could do with a little bit of focus, a little bit of attention to get to grips with and to work with. And as mentioned back on the first season of the Single Era Diaries, I did this episode on the attachment styles, and it was the first sort of overview really into what they are. And I think on reflection, having looked back at my assuredness and my confidence in that episode, that I was perhaps coming from a place of maybe more wishful thinking than factually based understanding. And so I've gone away and I've done a little bit more research into what attachment styles are and how they can show up. I guess for me to recap on what attachment styles are though, and just before I get into how they can perhaps show up in relationships, it's important to understand how our formative years have kind of contributed to those styles of attachment. If, like me, however, you find yourself being pretty unaware of what attachment theory is and where it comes from, quick overview. The theory was conceived by a psychoanalyst. His name was John Bowlby, and he was around a long time ago. So this is a pretty long-standing theory of attachment because he came up with this in the 1930s during his earlier career, where he was working in a psychiatric hospital, and that was really where the inception of the theory around attachment was formed. But flash forward to the present day, and if you haven't come across the term attachment, then maybe you're not as active on social media as I am, but there seems to be a lot, especially in the dating and the relationship world and the landscape, that talks about our attachment styles and how they present themselves, how they can impact not just our romantic relationships, but our relationships across the board, be that with our friends, be that with our family, be that with our work colleagues. And there are 4 core styles of attachment. So there's secure attachment, there's anxious attachment, avoidant, dismissive attachment, and disorganised attachment. And your attachment style, it does have a bearing, of course, on the way that you're showing up in relationships, but it can also impact how you're feeling internally and how you're processing your emotions as those relationships develop and unfold. So I previously declared myself as having a secure attachment. I did that without having done any sort of quiz or analysis to identify as to whether that's true or not. And what I found is that whilst I do in many respects feel secure, as I'm continuing to explore this period of change and transformation in my life and this real sort of introspective self-exploration and inner work, particularly whilst I'm embarking on new relationships, I'm not wholly convinced that secure attachment is where I'm fully at. And you might also find yourself in a similar position if you're in a period of change, be that a new style of living, be that in a new partnership, be it just that you're kind of out of a relationship now and you're exploring dating and you're getting to know new people. You might also be having some ripples in the kind of attachment that you have typically shown up with. But let me start by getting into secure attachment and what that is. And it might resonate for you. You might feel that this is one that really does connect with the way in which you show up. If you are securely attached, you tend to feel more safe and stable, secure, and you're typically mostly satisfied in your close and intimate relationships. For those of you that do have a secure attachment style, you don't typically fear being alone, and at the same time you thrive in identifying and enjoying meaningful relationships that are close, that are fairly transparent, that are emotionally balanced, and they're relatively stable. Having a secure attachment style, whilst arguably the strongest of the attachment styles from a psychological standpoint, having that style of attachment doesn't necessarily equate to perfection, and nor would it exclude you from experiencing challenges or issues in your relationships. It does typically translate, however, to your being able to feel secure enough with your emotions that you can be accountable for the feelings that you're having. And as we all have in life, any sort of failings or mistakes or challenges that are made by you, that you're comfortable in feeling accountable for them and addressing them. Crucially, those with secure attachment are more comfortable and more likely to seek support if they feel that they need it. So going out to loved ones, to friends within their relationship, perhaps reaching out to a therapist or external support to actually help them process those feelings and those emotions is something that those with secure attachment can do quite well. There are some really great aspects of secure attachment that, if you're anything like me in this current period of life where change is present, these styles and behaviours can feel, or at least look like, a pretty ideal state of being to work towards. So when you are in that secure attachment style, you're not only able to engage well with others, but you also appreciate your own self-worth. You have high levels of self-worth, you're self-confident, and you're also comfortable with expressing yourself and your emotions in those intimate relationships. So that, in many ways, isn't just the good. It's being comfortable in expressing your fears, your concerns, your worries, your hopes, but also your needs, and being comfortable with saying, like, this is what I need from this relationship, and you feel empowered and engaged to present that. Whilst you're able to find that satisfaction with others, if you're secure at the same time, you have a great deal of strength in being able to openly seek that support and comfort from your partner, whilst not becoming overly anxious when the two of you are apart. And disclaimer, this is the part that I definitely need to do quite a bit of work on It could just be the new relationship status. I'm not entirely sure. But again, if you're in a new dynamic at the moment and exploring a completely new person and personality, then perhaps you're feeling in a similar situation. But being happy to go to your partner for support and encouragement. Of course, having a secure attachment style is a great enabler to that. But it's also worthwhile recognizing that safety and security in relationship does come with time. So when you're faced with challenges in life, when you are secure, you're resilient enough to work through them independently, but also in conjunction with your partner or your relationships as you work on bouncing back from whatever it is that is challenging you in that current moment. For those that have anxious attachment, and I interestingly feel that there are facets of this that definitely permeate my my style and how I feel about myself. But those that do have an anxious attachment style, they typically struggle with trusting others. They can often have lower levels of self-worth. And the consequences for those who are anxious is that they can be this tendency to hold on to these kind of deep rooted fears of being abandoned. Now, despite their having those feelings, there's this almost paradox really of craving closeness and openness and intimacy, that they struggle with actually opening themselves up fully to that. The desiring of intimacy is, of course, natural for all of us. It doesn't matter whether you're in, a new relationship or a long-standing relationship, or whether you've just started dating. But if you're anxious and you're in any one of those scenarios, an overwhelming longing or that sort of constant feeling of not being enough could point to some aspect of you having an anxious attachment style. The longing, interestingly, it really does stem from this sort of like this persistent need to receive confirmation that things are okay, confirmation that you're loved, confirmation that you're cared for by others. And that can really be driven by this internalized doubt that if you are anxious, you might have this sense of instability around your self-worth, around your self-value, and around how you're showing up for yourself and in the wider world. Those also with the anxious attachment style tend to be a bit more hypersensitive and maybe more overly vigilant regarding their partner's actions and their emotions and their behaviours. And the sensitivity around that, it can really differ from healthy responses that somebody that's more secure might have to criticism or even disagreements. It can show up as having this sort of this desire to kind of scan constantly the environment and the relationship for any potential signs of there being abandoned or left, or it could be fueled by this fear of your partner leaving. And I think this is really important to bear in mind. So for anybody that has gone through a breakup, a breakdown of a relationship, the end of a marriage, the demise of a long-term partnership, and if there has been any infidelity as part of that breakdown or even shortly after the fact, then there will potentially be this feeling of anxiety that persists into your new relationship. And that's something that I am very much challenged by, this sense of, gosh, this happened to me, could that happen again? Is it something about me? Am I unlovable? Am I not enough? Like, how will that show up again? Am I doing things in the right way to kind of keep this person interested? Then moving on from the anxious attachment, there's avoidant attachment. And this is another form of more insecure attachment. It's really characterised, though, by more of an emotional detachment. And for those that have this avoidant attachment style, they can very often struggle with intimacy. They can avoid vulnerability. This can be, in many regards, an unintentional response, which can largely be formed as a bit of a coping mechanism. For those that have this style of attachment, it might be more difficult to maintain emotional intimacy or openness. It can lead to or result in sort of physical or emotional distance from their partner. And it's really typical, oftentimes, for those that do have an avoidant attachment style, to find it challenging to seek out help or to open up when experiencing emotional challenges or needs. They could come across as being hyper independent, very self-reliant. It could be a case of having sort of limited close relationships, but again, at the same time, in a similar sense to that of anxious attachment, it could also have this sort of yearning for that closeness and those more intimate relationships, but lacking the trust and the capacity to really lean into those deep emotional connections with others, which only goes to sort of further exacerbate the cycle of loneliness and that feeling of lack of connection. I think, interestingly, again, with all of these attachment styles, whilst you might be one, what you could identify is that the person that you are dating or in relationship with or in long-term partnership with, you could, whilst listening to this, think, okay, well, that's not me, but that's definitely my partner. They're really avoidant when it comes to acknowledging their feelings, when it comes to their opening up to me. And the understanding of all of these attachment styles is not only for you to understand yourself, but to also seek to understand your partner and to identify, well, where will they need a bit more additional support in responding to that particular style of attachment. The last of the attachment styles is disorganised attachment, and this is very often found in individuals who perhaps have a history of trauma. In adulthood, it shows up as almost manifesting as being a struggle to trust oneself, but to also trust others. And this can really result in, again, difficulties in maintaining emotional stability. It can manifest as having this inconsistency within relationships. And again, if you're dating and you're out in the world meeting new people, or if you are at the commencement or entering into a new relationship, if you're identifying any of these traits, it will be really worthwhile, I feel, to have a conversation around attachment styles with that significant person, especially if it is developing into a relationship, just to really get to grips with what your attachment style is and what theirs is, so that you can really cover off how best to understand and interpret the needs of the other person, how to show up, how to support, how to engage, but also how to hold space for how those styles of attachment are manifesting in your relationship. And if you're new to attachment styles altogether, rather than just relying on sort of my word for it on the podcast, there's some really excellent resources out there, as I'm sure you can imagine, that can help you to better understand what your style of attachment is. I'll actually link in the show notes, there's one particular quiz that's created by the Attachment Project. And the Attachment Project really aims to help individuals discover how their early childhood experiences with their parents has a bearing on the ability that you then go on to have in developing and nurturing and maintaining relationships as an adult. It's a quiz that, when you get into it, it takes you through a series of questions. It asks you to reflect on the relationship that you had with your mother or mother figure, your father or father figure, and if you have one presently, a partner or significant other. It also includes in there an area for you to reflect on the dynamic that you have within your friendship connections. Now, interestingly, I did do this quiz, and it did cement the notion that I do have a secure form of attachment, which I am finding interesting, because currently I am, full disclosure, feeling secure in many parts, but there's also aspects where I'm feeling quite anxious and a little bit more insecure than I would ideally feel. But I do note and acknowledge that those feelings of anxiety and instability do come from the fact that I am so far removed from my comfort zone, exited from a long-term relationship that was so very well defined, and there was an understanding of, types and styles and communication and patterns and what didn't work. And then when you're in a new relationship with a brand new person, you really don't have any of that additional context, and you're navigating through all of the things that are coming up for you as part of the new relationship, all of the work that you may not have done as a result of your previous relationship, all of the internal inner child shadow work that you may perhaps have to do. And this certainly is the case for me. There's all of these different environmental situations that are relating to the period of change that show up in slightly different facets of an attachment style. It's really very interesting to gain an insight, I guess, into, understanding more about yourself, but as I say, more about the person that you are in relationship with. And if you are interested, I'll link in the show notes the quiz, and you can have a little exploration of what that is and how that shows up. As with anything though, when it comes to our habits, our behaviours, our ways of thinking, our styles of being, you might be, as I am, wondering, well, can you change your attachment style? And as with all of those things, habits, behaviours, ways of being, the answer is yes. You can absolutely change what your current status is, and you can work on the facets of your way of showing up in your relationships and how you're feeling. You can do the work around those so that you can move to a more secure way of feeling and being. It's important to know though that trauma and traumatic events, like significant life changes, like the unraveling of a family, like the separation, like co-parenting, like being in this new world, like all of those aspects of our lives can impact our attachment style. And the recognition that our attachment style isn't fixed is great, but it's also the recognition and holding space for the fact that whether you're anxious, secure, avoidant, disorganised, that there will be a state of flux with those styles of attachment, depending on what your current situation is, how far you are into doing this work with yourself, but also with the person that you're in relationship with. No matter what your style is, even if it's disorganised, even if it's anxious, even if it's avoidant, maintaining a healthy relationship is always achievable. If you don't yet have that secure attachment style, you can pick up the facets of how you are showing up, and you can do that inner work to identify the areas that you want to perform some greater understanding, a bit more of a deep dive, in order to move you closer to that secure attachment style. The first step though, as with anything when it comes to our psychology and our way of being, is to really gain an insight into what that is. And that's why I would encourage anyone listening to have a little look into what your attachment style is, so that you can understand that some more, and that you can identify additional resources. It might be something that, if you are in therapy, that you would want to work through with your therapist or with your counsellor, or even, as mentioned, working through that with your current relationship partner. Critically, what I'm finding, and you might also find to be the same, is that understanding what your attachment style is empowers you. It empowers you to recognise and to address any less healthy thought patterns. It enables you and it empowers you to identify where you want to do the work and what that work might involve. And the fact that attachment styles are malleable does mean that you can make the necessary interventions, that you can make the effort required, that you can do this in partnership with the person that you're in relationship with, to help heal those aspects of your thought patterns and your behaviours and your thinking, to heal around them, and to then transform and move that attachment style to something that is much more secure. It, for me, feels pretty daunting. I really am getting to grips with a new world that I am in, and if you're anything like me and you are finding yourself in this any new dynamic where there's a lot of unknown quantity, And there could well be all of this really wonderful, beautiful stuff like connection and chemistry and shared interests, but then there's all of this emotional stuff that goes underneath. It can feel daunting to work through this stuff, but it really does come down to acknowledging that no matter where we are, even if we're in an established relationship and we're doing this work, even if it's a long-standing marriage or partnership, somebody that we've been with for like 20, 30 years, it's still really vital to understand ourselves and the person that we're with a view of working through that healing journey together. New relationships, starting over, establishing connection, establishing connectivity and intimacy with a whole new person, but also with a person that you've been with for a time, it can present a series of challenges. It can present a number of emotional exposures that you perhaps haven't explored before. And that is an opportunity to unpack them and to work through them. Perhaps more so when you've got children involved, or there's life challenges or changes that are happening. We're living in interesting times. There's a lot that's going on in the wider world, and so none of this work is performed in a vacuum. It's all performed whilst we have the wider environment spinning around our heads and alongside our life. With all of those things though, and with all of the baggage that we have, and I'm finding this particularly now as I'm embarking on a new relationship, you go into these partnerships and these relationships and every single one of us has baggage. We all have baggage. We have baggage from our childhood. We have baggage from our formative teenage years. We have baggage from our early adulthood. We have baggage from the life that we have perhaps moved on from or lost or left behind. And we can either choose to sidestep that baggage and just to, ignore its presence, or we can choose to unpack it. And part of that unpacking means unpacking together and opening up what that baggage is and working through it, as opposed to ignoring the fact that it's there. And if you're in a similar space to that I am right now, where it's working through the emotions that haven't yet been processed, where it's leaning into new challenges, where it's opening up yourself to feel vulnerable with a new person and to expose parts of yourself that you haven't had to look at or expose for a really long time. And the distinction between being in a relationship where you're comfortable and you've been in it for a long time and you know the other person and you understand how that person ticks to some extent and you're fairly well settled, and then you're in something new and you're getting to grips with all of that. Of course there's going to be baggage to unpack. And the invitation is to work through it and to get to grips with it. And it's something that I'm doing. And maybe you want to do that too. So that is the end of today's episode. I'd like to thank you for listening again. And over the course of the next couple of weeks, we are going to be having some guests on and we're going to be unpacking some things with a little bit more detail. But for now, thank you so much for listening to the Single Era Diaries. If you are dating, date safely. If you are exploring your attachment styles, unpack that safely, be kind to yourself, and as ever, peace out. The Single Era Diaries is produced and distributed by Nascent Media and executive produced by me, Jade Graham. Podcasts grow by being liked and shared, so if you enjoyed today's show, then please be sure to like and share with a friend who you think will enjoy the show too. Subscribe, and if you have a moment to rate and review wherever it is that you listen to your podcast, that would be super appreciated too. Thank you for listening, and peace out.